Hello there, and welcome, Virtual Space Hero community, to another Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live today. And we're going to dedicate our time and the discussion to a burning topic that came up in almost each and every past conversation with our international guests that we had here. And it is about the leadership development programs. So, what we have been seeing in the past years is that there is really a very strong need to now, particularly for the virtual and the hybrid context, to think again what skills do our managers need and how do we support them to acquire those skills. And previously, we have been discussing also efforts of organizations and how they're investing their money in training and workshops and facilitation. But sometimes they only see a very, very low return on investment on programs that they are running. The same is happening when it comes to executive education. And we see there's a lot of money sort of thrown out of the window because managers sometimes are not able to really adapt their behavior and the changes that trainers try to make during the trainings or try to stimulate during the trainings are not really taking place afterwards. And this is why I'm super happy to have been again suggested to run and invite one of the leading experts of leadership trainings from the United States, connecting from the Tiago Group, the Learning Development Accelerator founder, Matthew Richter, who will be discussing with me this hot topic of why do traditional leadership trainings fail. And here we welcome Matthew on the stage. Hi there, Matthew.
Hello. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you so much for making time in your busy calendar. I know that you're in between traveling to New York. You already got there, right?
I'm in a hotel, so if I look funny or if I freeze for anything, New York City Wi-Fi is never good.
Thanks again, Matthew, for accepting my invitation to join me here to discuss the topic of why do traditional leadership trainings fail. And with that, I directly jump into my first question. I know that you have been running leadership development programs for decades. So what is it that you have seen if you compare when you started to what is happening today? What was the development in the field?
Well, first of all, it's not just me saying this. There are tons of people, both from an academic perspective and from a pragmatic practitioner perspective, who are asserting that traditional leadership development programs don't work. Traditional leadership development programs could be viewed as putting together high potentials into a multi-month program and teaching them different theories of management, teaching them a particular model of leadership, asking them to go solve certain problems absent a particular context. There are all different ways in which people have approached leadership. But when we start to actually do impact studies, we find that they don't work. And Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's a professor at Stanford University, is a great resource. He wrote a wonderful book called Leadership BS. I'll let you imagine what that sounds like. But anyway, his first two chapters are a beautiful takedown of the leadership development industry. But his takedown is tame compared to Harvard and Professor Barbara Kellerman, who has written several books explaining why traditional leadership programs don't work. And the bottom line is, I like to think of it as four categories. The first is we often don't know what we're talking about. We don't have clarity on the definition. So we have a definitional problem when it comes to leadership. Are we talking about leadership, or are we conflating it with management skills? Mm-hmm. Are we talking about transformational leadership, or are we talking about situational leadership? Are we talking about servant leadership, or are we talking about trait-based leadership? There are tons and tons of models out there, and we very rarely align to one, nor do we align to one that is going to actually work in how we do things. Peter Northouse is a wonderful researcher who wrote a great book that I think he's up to 19 somewhat research-oriented models. And I say somewhat because the research is a bit foggy. Sometimes according to him too. And he gives a wonderful summary of each of the models with the pros and cons. But again, what are we talking about? Which leadership model are we ascribing to? Which one are we buying? A lot of times we go to our executives and ask them to define leadership. And of course, you're asking people who may be doing it well, but are probably not the experts at bringing out the qualities that we need to design and teach in our programs either. So we're letting people who are not qualified decide how they should construct and think about leadership. So that's one problem. By the way, feel free to interrupt me, or anyone can heckle me. I don't know if the audience can communicate with us.
Absolutely. There
They
are
are
always
welcome to heckle me.
questions that
If
can be
if anyone wants to really attack anything I'm saying, I'll pay them. So happy to. But the second problem we're dealing with is, let's say we do solidify on a particular leadership model, and we're distinguishing properly between leadership, management, command, and so forth. Well, how do we know that what we're teaching is valid? Valid means that what we're teaching in our leadership program actually yields what it says it does. How do we know that it's reliable? In other words, when I teach this cohort of 20 people, teaching the same thing to another cohort of 20 people will yield the same effect. So when we're building training or we're building learning experiences, we need to make sure that what we're teaching is accurate and that what we're teaching will yield consistently the same outcomes that we hope they will. And if not, and we're spending millions and millions of euros to achieve that, that becomes problematic. And what people like Pfeffer and Kellerman have shown is we're not getting those returns. Another researcher, Lacerenza, I didn't, I'm not going to say it right. I'm sorry. There's a wonderful literature review by Lacerenza. I was right. And all. There's a whole bunch of authors in it from 2017. And they did a review of all these experiments on leadership development programs to see, well, are they actually working? And what was cool was they said, yes, these leadership programs are working, except for one problem with the analysis. We're conflating management programs. So a lot of the things that were working in these programs have to do with traditionally management-oriented topics. So then how are we defining management versus leadership, which is an age-old conundrum and so forth? And that becomes highly problematic. Veronica is asking, what about the personnel, cultural, and contextual aspects of leadership? I am so glad you brought that up because that's problem number 3. Problem number 3 is that leadership, regardless of how we approach it, assuming we land on a good definition and assuming that what we do land on has some validity and reliability, well, it's always going to be contextual. So what works today is unlikely to work tomorrow. The knowledge, skills, abilities, attitudes that are inherent in an effective leader don't work in every context. Now, how do I know this? And again, it's not just me. How do all these people know this? Well, we know because we can look in history and see examples of successes, and then the same approach getting applied fails. Or we see failures, and then the same approach succeeds. Why? Well, there's variance. And that variance is exactly what Veronica is talking about. There are cultural phenomena. There are different people involved. There are different competitors. There are different contextual elements. Cultural theorist Mika Ball from the Netherlands calls it the fabula when she talks about it from a literary perspective. Well, I like to steal that and think about these different cultural or contextual elements as creating a different form of a leadership story. So Veronica's point is dead on. It's spot on. So context, culture, personal attributes, and so forth change from place to place. So that's problem number 3, which brings us to the last problem. If you talk to executives will often tell you, we want our leaders to be ethical. We want our leaders to strive for results and take care of their people. They should be kind and generous. Oh, and let's support DE&I. By the way, I'm being sarcastic about the DE&I stuff. I love and advocate for DE&I, but I find it hollow when a lot of leaders and organizations espouse these things, and then you look at the executive team of all white men. And this does not yield consistency. So the goals that executives are often espousing for what they expect and want in a leadership development program are not the same behaviors that they have going and that they've succeeded with. Otherwise, they would be out of a job. And so we see little congruency often between the behaviors of our leadership and what they say they want us to teach. Now, that could be aligned with the definitional problem, but I often think it's an incongruency of values, goals, objectives, and so forth. The 4 problems we have: definition, validity and reliability, context, and inconsistent goal setting.
And I think, thanks a lot, Matt, for summarizing those important points. I think they're super valuable also to reconsider all the time when we as trainers are being hired to run or develop a leadership training or leadership development program, on how do we approach that, on how we do approach that with organizations, right?
Well, and I think this is part of the challenge with all the, if someone comes to me and says, we want you to do a leadership development program, I'd much rather say, well, what role are we looking to train? If we're taking the executive board and we're going to train them on leadership, okay, well, what is it we want your CFO to do? Obviously, there's the technical aspects of the role, right? There's understanding finance, managing liquidity, raising capital, that kind of stuff, the whole accounting processes. But what are some of the other aspects that we want and expect from this role in this job? In other words, what types of problems does your CFO have to solve? Same is true for the CEO and your chief operating officer and your chief risk officer and your chief human resource officer. So as we start to look at it, we have to do exactly what Veronica is alluding to and hone in on the context. And now we can say, let's build a custom program that enables this chief to be able to do her role effectively, as long as we're honing in on what problems she needs to solve.
Matt, another question here. So you also, I'm just thinking back to the problem number 1, the definitory problem, where we talk about all those different types and styles and theories of leadership. How do you approach this aspect on defining leadership theory, or sort of really deciding on a leadership theory when you develop a leadership training with a company? How do you approach this aspect as a trainer, as an expert?
So there are a bunch of folks like Nigel Payne and the wonderful historian Keith Grint, who do indeed embrace this notion that leadership is contextual. Now, what does that mean for us pragmatically? Well, Keith has taken a model from a bunch of guys, and of course, I can never remember anything. Rittel. Sorry. Geez, I really have trouble with my brain this evening. So Rittel is this guy who coined the notion of wicked problems. And I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, but a wicked problem is something that is just beyond our capacity to solve. It's such a complex, nuanced, it's a tapestry of issues. And when you have a complex problem like this, a wicked problem, It requires someone to facilitate other experts to try and figure out how to deal with it. And so leadership needs to have a whole bunch of systematic processes and procedures that can come to play to work through how to resolve these big, wicked issues, these big, wicked problems. A great example of a wicked problem is when companies were dealing with COVID 3 years ago. It came out of nowhere, and companies literally shut down. Well, what did they do? Or the war right now between Russia and the Ukraine. What do we do? How do we help people? How do we deal with our businesses? There's no easy answer. So wicked problems, according to Keith, require us, prescribe to us that we need to lead. So the context is we have a problem. It's really difficult. Leadership is required. But then they have what Rethought called tame problems. And what Keith says is that a tame problem is something that may be complex, complicated, and may have a lot of different moving parts, but it's tame because we know what to do. We know the process. We know the procedure. Maybe it's putting out a new product, or maybe it's how we close our books quarterly or go through a performance appraisal process. It could be a complicated process, but it's tame because we know. And that prescription is management. Managers execute procedures. Leaders solve complex, wicked problems, right? But then what about in an emergency? We don't have time for sitting down and working through a complex problem, and we don't have a way of getting people to execute policies and procedures. In an emergency, you need someone to stand up and command. And so based on the context of what problems you're facing, you lead, you manage, you command. And you need in your organization to have the different tools, systems, processes, procedures to approach that. And so leadership becomes systematic.
But based on this, on these thoughts that you were sharing now, what kind of leadership theory would be sort of your favorite theory that applies to this circumstances, environment, or cases, or approaches, or situations that you were describing?
Well, I think, again, you can't pick one, because your problems are going to dictate what you need. So sometimes I may need one person to stand up and inspire the masses, and to take from James McGregor Burns, to mobilize the masses to go from point A to point B through a shared objective, right? An influencer, right? This is the basis of transformational leadership. But that doesn't always work. And we've seen time after time again, inspirational leaders fail when the problem is too overwhelming, or we just had an inspirational leader and now we kind of need a little break, right? The context dictates it, right? So I don't advocate choosing one. I advocate us taking the problem, the situation, that the context, and saying, okay, how do we approach this problem? What are the processes, tools, procedures that we can employ? And that's why you can't just design a leadership program that's going to work every time. We have to design something that's going to work this time for a specific set of problems, and then be ready to adapt it to the next one when the next one comes along. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I think how do I pronounce it? Is it Liliana?
Liliana Simic is there.
Okay. So, but she's asking, role theory is particularly helpful in conceptualizing leadership as a relational activity and process without role expectations from followers. So this is actually stemming from very traditional transformational leadership. So coming out of the James McGregor Burns stuff. And this is excellent, but it also stipulates that someone is taking on that leader role. Someone is wearing the leader hat. Others are wearing follower hats. And you have leader interacting with follower, and you go into this whole kind of tapestry of people interacting with each other that way. Again, that can work in certain contexts. But in other contexts, it becomes less about the people and more about the functions that you have. And sometimes leadership is not about humans. It's about having a leadership function that's more of a system. And again, I'll urge you to read some of the stuff from Nigel Payne, or if you want some of the academic research, just email me and I'll be happy to send you some of the academic research. I have a whole bibliography that's like 9 pages long on this stuff. So, but systems-based leadership is really kind of new, about 10 years old, where we remove the notion of people having specific roles and focus on what the functions are within an organization that require leadership, require management, require commanding, based on the types of contextual situations you're in.
And it's interesting because we were talking before, and you mentioned that also, and it's also what Veronica is asking here. We were talking about also those abrupt and difficult changes and uncertain moments that we are living. And indeed, I also wanted to ask you, how do leadership programs need to adapt to a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world? Like Veronica is asking, how do leadership programs face uncertain times?
Hey, raise your hand if you're a leadership development consultant or trainer. Okay, then I apologize for what I'm about to say. But don't do them. Let's stop doing these programs. They don't have a positive impact. They aren't measurable. We're not able to regress from these programs the positive parts from the parts that are just correlated with people doing what they would have done anyway. Let's stop doing them. Instead, let's say, what is this uncertain time that we're in? Let's analyze what are the attributes of it. Take COVID, for example. There are all these different ways we could have approached COVID more effectively. We can learn that now with some hindsight, but in the moment, could we sit down and do that? Well, the woman who was leading New Zealand did that highly effectively. Others, like Donald Trump, failed at doing that in the United States, right? And that's just from the political aspects. In each of our organizations, from a business perspective, an academic perspective, and so forth, the leadership team had an opportunity to sit down and say, we don't know what's coming. How are we going to approach this? And no course, no program was going to necessarily prepare them for those uncertain times. If it did, they wouldn't have been uncertain, right? So we need to prepare for that. Now, are there transferable skills and abilities? Well, sure, but those aren't necessarily distinguishably leadership.
Matt, I also want to come back to one aspect that we picked up in the first part of our conversation, and it's about the applicability and the way that our managers or learners apply the learned content, the knowledge that they acquired in their daily behavior. So what do you see still is the major problem? Why do leaders or learners rarely apply their learnings in daily life?
Well, number one, there's no support often in the workflow. What do? We put people into a program, and then have we trained their bosses to reinforce and support what they've learned? Usually not. Have we trained their peer groups to reinforce it? Probably not. Have we created analog scenarios and situations that are like what they would have to deal with in the workplace, so that when they experience something in a classroom, they see how to solve the same problem in a context back on the job? Probably not. But people who are doing wonderful design, who are incredible instructional builders like Miriam Neal and Julie Dirks and Clark Quinn, these are some of the best people in our industry. And they all talk about having to transfer that learning back into the workflow, and to do so using performance support, reinforcements, and to ensure that that the other people aren't putting activities or situations that conflict or contradict what you've taught them. So we have to do that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm just thinking also what you mentioned at the beginning. So their peers, their managers were not trained or are not onboarded to the topic or to the changes that the leadership program wants to sort of stimulate. So we have to think probably of a rather systemical and more holistic approach rather than just training some leaders. Is that what you wanted to say?
Well, I want to be careful that I'm not saying that we want to think about things holistically in a kind of fuzzy wuzzy was a bear kind of way. I mean, I want us to think about things holistically in the sense that we need to look at a whole context, right? And so we need to say, okay, we're dealing with the company is hemorrhaging capital. We have no money. Our revenue has changed because we've lost our value proposition in the marketplace. We're facing an existential problem with our business. How do we resolve this? Well, if we just throw new product at it, or we bring in a sales trainer to work on value propositioning and objection handling, we are not going to solve those, right? That's too tactical. We need to elevate the conversation and say, okay, well, what is our business? How are we going to approach this? What is the problem? What's the root cause of this problem? And because it's likely a wicked problem, there might be 10 root causes and 50 different problems. And that's why we need the smartest people in the room working through this together. So I don't want us to just think holistically on a simplistic level. I want us to get uber complex because that's how you resolve it. I'm a pacifist, but Dwight Eisenhower in the UK and the Allies, there's wonderful case studies from World War II when they were looking at how to build the Normandy invasion. And we're talking about a billion, I'm exaggerating, it's probably just a million moving parts. And for them to think through all of those things and to be able to manage cause and effect as they went through the planning and then subsequent execution, it's incredible. And so it can be done. To think through these large scale problems can be done. But we need to be willing to embrace some of the complexity and acknowledge our own shortcomings. I hate the way the collective intelligence is utilized today. The collective intelligence is not, we want to hear from everybody. No. If you take a group of idiots, you put them in a room and ask them to solve a problem, they are likely to provide you with an idiotic solution. But if you take a group of experts who are truly masters of their subject domain, and they come from different perspectives, and you pose that problem in their domain, then they're likely to come up with something possibly that will be useful. And that's what the collective intelligence was originally all about. But we've made it such that now everybody gets a say and everybody has a voice. But I don't think we want the accountant in the room helping to make decisions about your medical care, right? We don't go ask the CFO how the doctor should handle your cancer treatment. We need to rely on domain experience, right?
And you know what? I think this also relates. I'm not sure if I understood correctly. Veronica is smiling here, but I think Liliana was saying, what are the limits? And I'm not sure if that refers a little bit to exactly what you were saying now. What are the limits of participatory leadership? People love to use this term now. I'm not sure, Matt, if I sort of connected here correctly.
Why don't we ask Liliana? Because I'm not sure I understand. I think I understand what she's alluding to around participatory leadership, where everyone can lead, but I'm not sure if I truly am. So Liliana, will you clarify in the chat, or I don't know if you're allowed to come on a microphone.
That's technically, unfortunately, not possible here. But Liliana, if you could elaborate.
So, but while she's typing this, my belief is that participatory leadership is this notion where everyone has an opportunity to lead at different times, or everybody has a voice. Well, the problem is that, as I was saying before, we don't want everyone to have a voice. We want people who know what they're talking about to have a voice. Otherwise, we end up with all sorts of problems, like people not taking vaccines, or we end up with people not doing stuff that they probably should do. That doesn't mean that science sometimes makes mistakes or experts don't screw up. It's that we minimize the likelihood of stuff going wrong if we take the experts and have them work on it. Doesn't mean they won't screw it up or blow up the world. Experts have screwed things up royally over time, but they've done a lot better than the non-experts over time. And so I will always put my money on the experts over non-experts. So what that means is I don't always want everybody to have a voice in leading. I want the people who know what they're talking about to have a voice in leading.
And you know what? This connects me just to the thought that if you want to know, so all our viewers out there, if you want to know and listen to the experts in the field on how to design leadership programs that are effective, check out the follow Matthew on LinkedIn, connect with him on LinkedIn, but also check out the TIAGE webpage to find out about the upcoming program in May in New York City about principles on how to design effective leadership programs. Also, at this point, just to mention again, fantastic content, weekly and monthly conversation, and yearly conferences at the Learning Development Accelerator, ldaccelerator.com, where you can find a lot of content all around learning, but also, of course, leadership programs. Matt, with this, I'd love to have one last question for you. And if we still get a participatory question from Liliana, of course, we pick that up. But would you like to give us, to sort of sum up our conversation, our discussion, what are examples of successful leadership development programs that you designed or that you have seen that you were invited to evaluate?
Well, I think the most successful program is the one we did for a specific problem in a specific situation for a specific context. And then the next successful one was totally different for a different context with a different set of problems and so forth. And so for me, it's very, very important for us not to take a model of what worked once and expect it to work again. So the problem I think with leadership development is we're looking for a consistent way to develop leaders, and it just doesn't exist. There are too many variables, and we got to deal with that and accept that. Also, one model doesn't fit. So embracing one theory or one model of leadership isn't going to work. So the best programs take the problem. If you start with the problem, and if it's a wicked problem, big, hairy, audacious problem, then we can work on how to facilitate people through learning how to deal with that. But it has to be contextual. Now, my friend Kat Koppett talks about the fact that there are indeed transferable skills, like how do you approach analyzing a problem? Well, we can teach that. But I would teach that to managers. I teach that to project managers. I teach that to non-managers who are analysts. So a lot of these transferable skills are not distinct for leadership. So what defines leadership? Well, it's getting trickier and trickier for us to align around that. But it's really about how do we get the masses to align toward the common goal of solving one of these huge, complex, wicked problems. It looks like we got a response from Liliana.
Absolutely, I see that. But I just pick up on her other comment, because I think this also summarizes nicely what you were saying about how to pick a leadership theory, because she's saying we should certainly not fall in love with our tools.
No.
So that is what very often happens to trainers, to us designers, right? That we pick up on theories or on tools that we like to.
I do love my iPhone. I love my.
You love your iPhone.
Yeah. Yeah. But other than the iPhone, I totally agree.
And here we go with our last comment, Matthew. So the term is often used as set of methods of participatory conversational formats in training where in fact leadership is losing its meaning somehow.
I
Do
think
you want to comment on that?
I totally agree. I think we're conflating so many terms like the Lars Serenza. I'm so sorry, I'm butchering that paper where the impact is initially really cool, that leadership development works, except that when we start looking at it, we're talking about management development. And if you do a cross analysis of Cotter and Bennis and a bunch of these business leadership gurus, it's really fascinating because if you just say in 1990, Cotter identified setting a direction as a definition for leadership. For management, it's planning and budgeting. What the heck's the difference? Aligning people is leadership. Organizing and staffing is management. I don't get it. Motivating is a leadership activity. Controlling and solving the problem and controlling the environment. Well, a little bit different, but come on, right? Mastery of the context, control of the environment. These don't make sense. These distinctions are not there. And so I think Liliana is dead on. I think she's spot on there again, right? I think we're conflating too many different ideas. Our definition isn't clear, which brings us back to the definitional problem, a validity and reliability problem. We have a contextual problem, or we have context. Therefore, we don't have the same scenarios. And of course, we don't have appropriate aligned goals and values around this. And so that's why leadership development traditionally doesn't work. But if we focus on the core problem, we can work on solving those problems in context and give people skills, knowledge, foster abilities, and support different attitudes along the way.
That sounds fantastic, Matthew. And again, I strongly recommend to connect with Matthew on LinkedIn, but also to check out again the tyagi.com webpage. Check out whether you would be able to join them in New York City in May for their upcoming Design of Leadership program training, but also for ongoing sort of exchange with L&D professionals from across the globe, the ldaccelerator.com. All of them available, also represented on LinkedIn, sharing always fantastic content. Matthew, it was fantastic having you again here. I know that you are busy and that you are running out to another meeting now in New York. I have a very good virtual cocktail prepared backstage, so I'm joining you there in a minute. Thank you very much for being with us.
Anyone who wants to come hang out in New York with me and Tyagi, I'll knock 10% off the price. Just send me an email and you tell me you're from Barbara. And if you say Barbara and I want to come to New York, I'll knock off 10% for you.
Oi, that is a fantastic offer. And we have here, love it, Matt. But I think that was not only for the 10%, but also for the last statement. Thanks a lot, Veronica and Liliana, for your active comments, and everybody out there for participating in our live conversation and watching us. Matthew, I'll join you backstage in a bit. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Virtual Space Hero community, also for providing us with your questions ahead of the live show. We do know that not always it's possible to participate live in the conversation and ask your questions. So don't worry, provide us with your questions ahead, and I'll make sure to include them so that when you watch it afterwards, the answer will be there. Connect with Matt. It's really fantastic. He's a source. He's an inspiration when it comes to learning and development. Connect with him on LinkedIn and check out tyagi.com and ldaccelerator.com. With that, I am going to leave you for a beautiful morning, afternoon, or a good night. And I hope to see you also next week on the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn live stage. We have all guests lined up until the end of June. So go also to our webpage, virtualspacehero.com, and you find them all there. It's always Thursdays. And with that, I see you very soon. And don't forget to become a virtual space hero.